of this nation. Under skies so blue, there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true. From the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe. Conservative values in our souls, they're interweaved.
Welcome back, everyone, to Deep Dive Podcast Show. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that touches all our lives, how the food we eat and the policies around it are impacting American health and, surprisingly, even the profits of big pharmaceutical companies. It's a complex web, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's an incredibly important conversation. And it's not just about what's on your plate. It's really about the entire system that brings that food to you, from government policies to corporate decisions. For decades now, the U.S. has seen policies that, while maybe well-intentioned for food safety and availability, have actually contributed to a pretty serious public health crisis.
A public health crisis? That's a strong statement. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that? How have these policies really shaped what we eat and the consequences we're seeing?
Well, think about it. We're seeing a huge increase in chronic diseases like obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease. These are all strongly linked to the prevalence of unhealthy foods in our diet, stuff that's often loaded with sugar, salt, and unhealthy fats. This situation doesn't just make millions of Americans sick, it also creates a really lucrative market for the pharmaceutical industry, which then profits from treating these preventable conditions. It's a cycle, you know?
That's a powerful connection. So let's talk about the regulatory side. Who's in charge of making sure our food is safe and healthy? And are they actually doing what they're supposed to be doing?
The main players here are the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA. They're supposed to regulate our food supply. But here's where it gets tricky. Many critics argue that these agencies have often leaned more towards protecting the interests of big food corporations rather than prioritizing public health. For instance, the FDA has approved tons of food additives, preservatives, and artificial sweeteners. And honestly, some studies are now suggesting that some of these substances might actually have adverse health effects.
Adverse health effects from things approved by the FDA? Can you give us an example?
Sure. One study, published in a leading environmental science journal, found that many common food additives, like emulsifiers and artificial flavors, things you see in so many processed foods, can actually mess with your gut bacteria. And when your gut bacteria are out of balance, it can lead to inflammation and metabolic disorders. Despite findings like these additives are still everywhere in processed foods, which certainly plays a role in our obesity epidemic and other health issues.
That's really concerning. It sounds like a lot of what ends up in our food isn't necessarily there for our health. What about government subsidies? How do they fit into this picture?
Oh, subsidies are a huge part of the problem. The government provides subsidies for commodity crops like corn, soybeans, and wheat. This basically makes these ingredients super cheap to produce, which then encourages the overproduction of processed foods. Think about it. These processed foods are often high in calories but low in actual nutrition. A study by the Union of Concerned Scientists, for example, found that between 1995 and 2010, federal subsidies overwhelmingly supported ingredients that go into junk food, with only a tiny fraction going to fruits and vegetables. This imbalance has made unhealthy foods much more accessible and affordable, which unfortunately drives poor eating habits across the country.
So we're essentially subsidizing our own health problems. And I imagine these large food corporations have a hand in shaping these policies, right? What role does lobbying play here?
You hit the nail on the head. The food industry's lobbying efforts are incredibly influential. According to a report by the Center for Responsive Politics, the food and beverage industry spent over $30 million on lobbying in just 2020 alone. That's a staggering amount, and it often results in policies that favor corporate interests over public health, such as weakening nutritional guidelines or making it easier to approve those controversial food additives we talked about earlier.
It's clear there's a systemic issue here. Let's shift gears and talk about the science behind all this. What exactly do these unhealthy foods do to our bodies?
Well, the science is really clear and pretty well documented. Processed foods, which are often packed with sugar, salt, and unhealthy fats, have been linked to a whole host of chronic diseases. These foods are often engineered to be incredibly palatable, almost addictive, which leads to overconsumption and inevitably poor health outcomes. Let's break down some of the biggest culprits.
Okay, let's start with sugar, since it seems to be in everything these days.
Sugar is a massive contributor to the obesity epidemic. A study published in a major medical journal found that added sugars in the American diet are a primary driver of rising rates of obesity and related metabolic disorders. Think about the high fructose corn syrup in so many processed foods and drinks. That stuff has been shown to increase your risk of fatty liver disease, insulin resistance, which can lead to diabetes and cardiovascular disease. It's not just about calories. It's about how our bodies process these specific types of sugars.
And what about salt? We hear a lot about reducing sodium intake.
Salt is another major concern. The American Heart Association recommends no more than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day, but the average American consumes over 3,400 milligrams daily. That's way too much. Excessive salt intake is directly linked to high blood pressure or hypertension, which is a leading risk factor for heart attacks and strokes. And guess where most of that sodium comes from? You guessed it. Processed foods, fast food, and restaurant meals are huge contributors.
So both sugar and salt, deeply embedded in processed foods, are wreaking havoc. What about fats?
Yes, unhealthy fats, especially trans fats and saturated fats, are commonly found in processed foods and have long been linked to an increased risk of heart disease. One influential study published in the New England Journal of Medicine suggested that simply reducing trans fat intake could prevent thousands of heart attacks and deaths every year. Even with these findings, trans fats still pop up in many processed items, contributing to the high prevalence of cardiovascular disease here in the US.
That's a lot of traditional culprits, but I know there's also newer research looking at something called the gut microbiome. How do unhealthy foods impact that?
This is fascinating, newer research really. The gut microbiome is basically the community of bacteria and other microbes living in our intestines, and it plays a huge role in our overall health. Studies have shown that diets high in processed foods and low in fiber can seriously disrupt this delicate balance of gut bacteria. This disruption can lead to chronic inflammation and metabolic disorders, which are then linked to a whole range of health issues, including obesity, type 2 diabetes, and even some mental health disorders. So, what we eat literally changes the landscape of our insides.
Wow, so it's not just about the big organs, but even the microscopic world inside us. This all paints a pretty grim picture. And you mentioned earlier that this crisis actually creates a market for the pharmaceutical industry. Can you elaborate on that connection?
It's a really stark reality. The sheer prevalence of these chronic diseases, largely preventable through better nutrition and lifestyle choices, has created an incredibly lucrative market for big pharma. They profit immensely from treating these conditions. This dynamic raises a lot of ethical questions about the industry's role in what feels like a perpetuation of poor health and skyrocketing healthcare costs.
What's the economic impact of all these chronic diseases?
The economic burden is staggering. The Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, reports that chronic diseases account for 75% of our nation's healthcare spending. Heart disease and diabetes are among the most costly conditions. Treating these diseases involves incredibly expensive medications, frequent hospitalizations, and often long-term care, all of which contribute significantly to the exploding healthcare costs in the US.
And where do pharmaceutical profits fit into all of this?
Big Pharma has absolutely capitalized on this. They develop and market expensive drugs to manage these chronic conditions. A report by the Commonwealth Fund found that the US spends more on pharmaceuticals per person than any other country, and the prices for many drugs just keep climbing. This, of course, creates huge concerns about whether essential medications are affordable and accessible for many Americans.
It sounds like a vicious cycle where unhealthy food leads to illness, which then leads to expensive treatments. And I've heard some talk about a revolving door between industry and regulators. What does that mean, and how does it play into this?
That's a critical point. The close relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the very agencies meant to regulate it is a huge concern. The revolving door phenomenon means that executives from the pharmaceutical industry often move into regulatory roles and vice versa. This raises some serious questions about conflicts of interest and how much influence the pharmaceutical industry has over public health policy. One study even found that financial ties between drug companies and regulatory officials are common, which could definitely bias decision-making in favor of corporate profits rather than public well-being.
So, what can we do? This is a really disheartening picture. How do we even begin to address a crisis this big and entrenched?
It definitely is a big challenge, but there's hope. Addressing this public health crisis caused by unhealthy foods requires a multifaceted approach. We need significant policy reform, stronger regulation of the food industry, and much greater investment in public health initiatives. Imagine if policies prioritized public health over corporate interests, things like stricter regulations on those questionable food additives, or actually increasing subsidies for fruits and vegetables instead of junk food ingredients. These kinds of changes could dramatically improve the health of Americans and lessen the massive economic burden of chronic diseases.
That makes so much sense. It feels like we need to tackle this from all angles, from what's being grown to what's allowed in our food to how we're treating illnesses. So, as we wrap up, what's the key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
The main takeaway is that our unhealthy food environment here in the US, which is shaped by regulatory policies, corporate interests, and our own consumer habits, has directly led to a public health crisis that also enriches the pharmaceutical industry. The science is undeniable. Unhealthy foods are a huge factor in chronic diseases, and these diseases cost our nation an incredible amount. To truly fix this, we need a comprehensive approach, focusing on policy reform, stronger food industry regulation, and a much bigger focus on prevention and public health. By making the health of Americans our top priority, we really can reduce chronic diseases, lower healthcare costs, and build a healthier, more vibrant society.
You Democrats, bloated bureaucrats, like a New York sewer rat. Go away.